throne, as befits my status. I want to introduce the triple monarchy of this evening to you. Caroline Jester, as Lisa has said, is the author of this wonderful book, 50 Playwrights on Their Craft, which is a wealth of statements about playwriting, as well as a fascinating discussion of where playwriting might go. Joining Caroline to discuss the future of playwriting are two examples of the future of playwriting. CHARLENE James is a graduate of the Royal Court Young Writers Programme, has worked at Theatre 503 in the Birmingham Rep before breaking through to a wide audience with her wonderful play, Cutting It, which deals with the horrifying topic of female genital mutilation with sensitivity, authority and attack. TENA STIVICIC is a Croatian playwright and writer with an international profile who lives and works in London. Her plays include Fragile, Invisible and Three Winters, the last of which opened in 2014 at the National Theatre in a production directed by the late and very much lamented Howard Davis. I want to begin, Caroline, asking you about the title of your book. So it's called 50 Playwrights on Their Craft. I want to home in a bit on that word, craft. Why was it craft you wanted to pull out from these conversations, rather than, let's say, art, which is the other way that you might think about playwriting?
Well, may I just ask for your distinction on
art?
Sorry to throw it straight back to you, because I mean, what is art is a very big question, as well as.
Okay. Well,
you don't have to answer it.
Yeah, that's. I mean, that is of course a question, and we could spend an hour trying to answer it. I suppose I'm thinking that a conventional way of thinking about that would be that craft is sort of is kind of workmanlike. It's about carpentry and certain skills and forms and practices that make you a craftsman or woman, whereas art is a bit more. It's very conventional, about inspiration and magic and things you don't know where it comes from.
I suppose my interpretation of that question is art is the product, in a way. So we have the plays, so my interpretation of that question would be the art would be the plays that we see on the stage. And we have the plays on the stage. We can go and see them if the plays are lucky enough to find a stage. We have I suppose we have critics who talk about the plays if they're lucky enough to be reviewed, and we have audiences again if they're lucky enough to go and have a production. But we rarely hear, and we have academics. Brilliant academic books talking about the plays and putting them into context. But we very rarely hear from playwrights. And for me, playwriting is a craft that goes beyond the playwright as well. So it isn't the domain solely of the playwright. And I wanted to have a conversation start a conversation. I don't think this is a definitive conversation in any way. I hope this is the beginning of a conversation and widening a conversation about what craft is to the individual playwright and what that means within the wider context of their role as a playwright, as well as looking at stories, structure, but what does it mean about their responsibility as a playwright? I mean, we're talking about an art form that could be very old-fashioned, seen as very old-fashioned, but what is it about the craft of that art form that keeps it alive?
Absolutely. There's an interesting moment where you talk a little bit about craft in the book, and you kind of define it. It's not supposed to be a rigorous definition, but you describe it as the skill and understanding the playwrights have in turning their ideas into plays. I wondered if I could ask CHARLENE and TENA about that word understanding, which I suppose, this might be an odd question, how far do you feel you understand or are entirely conscious of what you're doing when you create a play?
I think each play is different,
yeah.
So I think there's always got to be a reason of why I'm writing this play and what I wanted to do, so I have to kind of understand what this thing that I'm wanting to do is going to do to an audience and how that's going to affect an audience. So that's an initial thing, and it might kind of lose its way and go into somewhere else. So there's always that I always try and think about what I want an audience to feel from that, and that comes in, I guess, with the understanding, but then it kind of just goes somewhere else usually.
Absolutely. And Tena, what about you? Do you feel very conscious in your process of creation, or are there things that perhaps you don't understand about what you're doing that you have to trust to instinct or something like that?
Increasingly I feel more conscious, but that's because my craft is better. It has become better with time. So, curiously, I think some of the best things best bits that I've written were written kind of instinctively and without necessarily relying on a plan. But the more I write, the more experience I have, the better my craft gets, the more understanding I have of what it is I want to do with what I want to say. And talking about craft, for me, this book, the way that it's titled, it's so much more interesting to me than talking about art, because those are the things that can be insightful, that can be helpful. Being a playwright is such a solitary job, and it's really useful to understand other people's process, other people's ways of understanding their craft, to help you along, so that you're not, so that you don't feel that you're relying on that magical, difficult to explain and understand idea of art, and not least because also talking about yourself and your art is a little bit narcissistic, I think. But then, I don't know, that's a particularly female approach to things, I think. So yeah, I think that's a more interesting conversation than talking about art, actually.
There's Caroline, if I go back to that definition, talk about understanding and skills, that one of the things that makes this book such an interesting conversation is that, for example, there is a wonderfully combative introduction by Edward Bond, a typically strident and extraordinary statement about playwriting. And in that, at one point, he talks about one of the problems with playwriting is the remnants of obsolete, mostly 19th century ideas and performance practices that have become skills. And I thought it was kind of interesting that there's that I suppose there's a debate there about whether, the kinds of forms that have been around for a long time, are they things that should be completely junked, or are they still useful? In your work as a dramaturg, how far do you find it useful to work with other playwrights through existing forms in that way?
I think there's place for both, or for more than two. I think there's place for it's a living art form. In my opinion, it's a living art form. Why people tell stories in the live media and how they tell stories in the live medium, both will change. Paula Vogel talks about the necessity to move away from the 19th century understanding of structure, and there's room for both. I'm currently working with the brilliant Yellow Earth Theatre Company, working with 4 writers, and we had a masterclass with David Edgar at Stratford last week, and very much using traditional, or what we think traditional playwriting structure. I'm not using the structure should be, and it was hugely informative, and it's huge. But I think to understand those rules, but to be able to subvert those rules, but rules is potentially the wrong word, as one playwright in the book says. The only rule to playwriting is there is no rule. I feel that our stages should have a place and should be open to different forms of telling stories. So so to answer your question in terms of dramaturgy, I hope every individual relationship, it's a very individual relationship, a writer and a dramaturg, and I hope that my role in that situation is always to facilitate the writer if they need facilitating, and that may come in many different forms. So yes, sometimes, but other times no.
So, I mean, it'd be interesting to ask Tena and Charlene, I suppose probably in this country your two most famous plays would be Cutting in Three Winters, and they almost couldn't be more different in some ways, because I'm going to now do the terrible thing of trying to describe a playwright's play to their face, which always goes wrong. But you know, I think of Cutting It as being this kind of really quite fast-moving, very contemporary, quite intensive, and fairly short, almost kind of one-act play feel to it. Whereas Three Winters is an epic play that covers, it's set in three time periods, 1945, 1990 and 2011, and it moves between them, and it tells an epic story about three generations of one family. So it would seem obvious that they must have been written in rather different ways. I wonder if you could just talk about how your play developed from the first idea to the form it eventually took, and then see what your experience of that was, admitting whatever it is you choose to admit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting you talk about like understanding of what that play was, and I knew from the start of talking to people about FGM and having those conversations that you could only do it for a short period of time until people was like, oh no, I can't listen to that anymore. So I knew that if I was going to write a play, it couldn't be a 3-hour play about female genital mutilation, and it kind of had to be fast and punchy, and this is the point I'm trying to make. So that was like a start of like the conversations and knowing that, okay, well, I know it's going to be kind of a shorter play, and you know, just the research I did, I watched a documentary and I didn't realise what FGM was, and kind of it really affected me, and I was really passionate about the subject, so I did a lot of research on it, and you know, I started to write scenes where I just felt like this is a play that is really, the themes of it and the issues are really hard hitting, and for an audience to sit and watch that, even though I knew it was going to be a short play, it's still quite a lot for an audience to sit through. So I was like, well, it needs to have some comedy, and we need to get the audience on side, and we need to get them to love these characters, whoever they are, so that when we do kind of get to that punch moment, they're going to go with them. So I knew that it was going to be like two young girls that we see on the buses every day and that we can relate to, and I thought that was really important that we relate to these girls. And it's such a personal thing for them to be saying, look, this is my experience of FGM. And it was almost like pages from a diary. So I knew that, you know, it was going to be into cutting monologues, which was like, I'm sharing this really personal thing with you, can you actually go out and do something about it?
Thank you. And Tena, do you remember how Three Winters developed from the original idea to the form it eventually took?
It was a pretty long process. It was almost like writing 4 plays, because they are sort of almost like, that's sort of 4 episodes in the life of the family. It actually came about because the Birmingham Rep at the time had an attachment scheme. I don't know if they still have it, where one of the possible sort of programs to apply to was writing for larger stages, and that's such a rare challenge for playwrights nowadays. You don't really get the opportunity to write for a larger stage, so you don't even you sort of end up not really knowing how to do that, because you're basically just writing sort of two-hander after two-hander. And then, except, if you're writing for the National, where you have to write a big play, which then nobody else in the world can put on ever again. So, so I wanted to take that opportunity to try and see what what writing for a larger stage means. And I happened to have a bit of a kind of a kernel of a story in my head, which came from the history of my family. Because we are all, on my mother's side, we're women in 4 generations. There was only female offspring in 4 generations, and now actually, since I've had my daughter, 5th generation. And the kind of extraordinary curve from my great-grandmother, who was a maid and illiterate and didn't have a voice and had terrible trauma happen to her, to a certain degree because she didn't have a voice and didn't know how to express what was happening, through the 4 generations to me in my life and the voice that I have and the voice that I use. That seemed to me like something that could be the start of a play, particularly because where I come from, Croatia, ex-Yugoslavia, each of those generations lived in a completely different country, in a completely different regime and a different set of values. So that was the beginning, but the process was very long, and I can't even remember exactly how it sort of came to its last incarnation, because there was a lot of research, and there was also just a lot of kind of orchestrating how to find the most succinct way of saying so many things and covering so much in what ended up being a 2.5-hour play.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Caroline, can I ask about the playwrights who are in this book? Because one of the things that's very striking is there's a great range of different types of writer, not all of whom I think I would immediately describe as playwrights, actually. They might be writers for performance in some way or something like that. But you were clearly quite determined to look at to define playwriting quite broadly. Could you say a little bit about what the idea behind that was?
I mean, there have been discussions, debates, arguments about what can be classed as playwriting, articles suggesting that you can't call yourself, you can't be classed as a theatre maker and a playwright. And you can't be a spoken word artist, although that's contested, that term in the book, by Sabrina Mahfouz, who says that is a term that she rejects. She is a poet, and that is a term that patriarchal white male culture of poetry is putting on her. And so what we wanted to do was what do these writers have in common? They write for live performance, that you need an audience. You need, for me, playwriting is, as I said, is a living art form. All voices are welcome in a space for live performance. So that is what we're trying to challenge. Not challenge, we're trying to, again, provoke a discussion or provoke a conversation about what it means to write for live performance. Who are these categories serving when we say, as Tim Etchell says in the book, we have a space for both. He didn't call himself a playwright at the beginning of the interview, thought he might call himself a playwright by the end of the interview. I think it's about writing for live performance.
Right. Another way in which you cross a certain border is that it's 25 US writers and 25 Britain-based writers. What did you find, looking at the spread of things, there are clearly shared concerns, but do you think there are different perspectives in the two theatre cultures from the writers?
If I just want to say that we wanted to be very clear that this was a book that has equality, 25, or half women, half male playwrights. I will come on to the... and also intergenerational. We're often told that there aren't many female playwrights. They were very easy to find. I've actually just been to Waterstones on the corner as I was coming, and I counted the number of female playwrights in the published text. They obviously didn't have the equality that we have in our book. Again, it's about, for me, it's about platform. It's about giving space to be included in the dialogue around the craft of playwriting. So an intergenerational was very important. Again, we don't, from my experience, we don't seem to have much of an intergenerational dialogue with plays in British theatre, and it was something that I very much wanted to explore. For example, here in this very building, I interviewed Chris Thorpe and Willie Russell on the same day, two playwrights that you wouldn't normally find in the same book. Chris Thorpe told me that Educating Rita was his favourite play, although saying that narrative is an option and something he doesn't use. Willie Russell was saying it is all about narrative, it's all about story. But there's something very interesting about that day and those two playwrights, and important that we value that conversation. So the US-UK, I'm personally very interested in exploring work, or starting to explore work that travels into and outside of the UK. We very rarely, we're getting more, I think, increasingly, well, a little bit more used to seeing work from outside of our shores on our stages.
Not for very long.
Don't know, no comment.
No, I just said not for very long, but
No, if it,
go ahead.
so the what I did get from the US conversations was there seemed to be more of a thinking about different generations of playwrights. I mean, obviously, well, not obviously, but in the US, it's more academic training to become a playwright. So there is a need to study playwrights in different generations, which doesn't exist to the extent here in the UK. There seemed to be more of a conversation around mentorship and about playwrights and a community of playwrights that I don't encounter here in the UK personally. And what I hope this book does is try to support a conversation about a community of playwrights being outside of the boxes we immediately would identify and put them in.
And you've now answered the next three of my questions. But anyway, but the other thing which is interesting is that I think all the interviews were conducted in 2016, which of course was, one of the most momentous and shocking years politically until 2017 came along, and then we realised it was not so bad. But also it was a year, as TENA has just alluded to, where the kind of identity of Britain and the identity of America seemed to be shifting under everybody's feet. Is that reflected, do you think, in the discussions of the book?
I hope so. I hope it's touched upon, obviously, but maybe Tena wanted to come in before I, because I know you wanted to say.
Well, yeah, I mean, what did I want to say?
Because at the end you talk, at the end of your interview, you mention.
Sorry, I don't remember what I said.
You mentioned about Europe becoming fragmented into smaller countries.
Oh yes. Well, I mean, I think Britain's always been, in terms of the theatre tradition, always been sort of on the outside of the European. There's quite a strong network of kind of exchange in Europe between theatres, and there are a few festivals that do new playwriting. Well, actually, the main one no longer exists, but there is a strong network, and Britain's always sort of been a little bit outside of that. And I don't know what the future holds, but it doesn't seem like it's going to be more included in the next few years or in the near future than it was before. So, and there's a marked difference between the playwriting tradition in Britain and in Europe. And in fact, I think in Europe, the function, the sort of old-fashioned function of a playwright is really kind of seems a little bit outdated at the moment. It's not a very kind of chic thing to be a playwright. It's more, dramaturg is more the sort of flavor of the decade, I think.
Right. And Charlene, can I ask you, I mean, it's a bit of a thing to spring on you, but do you think that the kind of rethinking of what Britain might be and its place in the world, a different perspective on what Britain is like, is that something that you feel your playwriting is going to respond to or will have to respond to?
Yeah, I think there's it's difficult because sometimes you think that, you know, when Brexit happened, there are 1,000 Brexit plays and everyone has to respond and every play has to be about that. So I worry about like trend plays of like, oh well, now it's going to be this dystopian future and we need to tell all of those stories. And I always go back to, if that's what you're passionate about, where Britain is in the state of the where we are now, is that story that you have to tell and tell it. But if you're just doing it just because that's what we should be telling, because that's what the conversation is out there, that's probably the wrong approach for it.
Right, absolutely. And Tena, actually, can I pick up on a couple of things that you were talking about? I suppose the first one would be that you've worked as a playwright in 2 different cultures, but also in 2 different languages. Do you find that there are things that you can say in Croatian that you can't in Croat that you can't say in English, and vice versa? Do the languages themselves propel different kinds of articulation?
Yes, even to the point where they sort of drive the narrative sometimes. So, because characters live in their language, and the language is such a live thing that sometimes, you know, a play on words which is possible in one language will lead the dialogue in a certain direction and end up taking the narrative in a certain direction. So I sometimes end up with 2 very different versions of the same scene or the same play because I do my own in English and Croatian. They're not really translations, they're sort of my own adaptations, I guess, of my own work. So I take a bit more poetic license, I think, than a translator would normally be allowed. But yeah, it really can change even to the structural level, what's available and what kind of sparks the action.
Absolutely. And I suppose one thing as well is that that's really interesting in the way you structure the book is that everybody's asked pretty much the same questions. So everybody, you can kind of compare everyone's answers, except Edward Bond, who refused to play that game. More on him in a moment. But one of the questions that you ask everyone is the deceptively simple question, what is a playwright? And you get an extraordinary range of answers. And just picking up a couple of them, Jose Rivera, he, in a long answer, he suggests that the playwright is a fool, a magician, a storyteller, a plumber, a surgeon, a carpenter, a canary in a coal mine, and a steward of the language, which I think is a pretty amazing list. Then David Gregg, even more bizarre list, a structurer of shamanic rituals, a crafter of vehicles in which actors travel, a manipulator of emotion through time, a poet, a Turkish carpet salesman, a psychic stripper, a naughty girl showing all the boys her pants. I could go on, he says. So that's quite a range to start with. Can I ask you 3? I know you 2 have answered it in the book, but you may have had other thoughts since. What for you is the heart of being a playwright?
It's interesting because I've started to write for other mediums now, and so for me it is about that, knowing that there's going to be a live audience in that room watching the play, and how I write that is very different to how I write for television. So it's how do I keep and just being aware of, how do I keep an audience from getting, because a TV audience can just get up and walk away, and we don't see that. But as a playwright being in there, you see where the audience are gonna live. So it's about how do I make an impact where somebody is right there, breathing and saying these words that you can give them, that an audience can have that interaction with somebody there that they can't do on a screen because they can just walk off. So I think that's like one of the biggest things of like when I'm writing a play, that's what it is. It's going to be this live thing that, you know, 50 people in a room are going to experience on one night, and then it's going to be different another night.
Yeah.
But how do I keep that essence of what I want to do the same?
Thank you. Caroline?
Just to contextualise why I asked that question, was because of the work I'd been doing in other countries at the time. One of them, I think you called it an honest failure project, Europa. I disagree. I think it was the start. I know, but I think it was the start of an experiment. It was a multilingual play that we did in Croatia, the UK, Germany, and Poland. And one of the things, I was doing some work for the British Council in Italy as well at the time, and one of the things that became increasingly I became increasingly more interested in is the role of the playwright, and there wasn't actually a common understanding of what that was. It didn't exactly mean the same thing in each country, so I was interested in having that conversation with the US playwrights as well, and especially if we were broadening it out into live art performers, theatre makers, many different titles. So that's just in terms of why that question was asked. It's a question, I think, it's a word we use, and we use, as we talked about art at the beginning, words we use very frequently, but we're not always actually understanding the same thing as the listener. So what is a playwright for me? A playwright is somebody who works and creates work for a live performance, something that happens in the present with an audience, in whichever way they feel is right for that piece of work, and the burning question that they feel is at the heart of their work.
And Tena, what is a playwright for you?
Specifically, I think there's something about playwriting that you have to inhabit all the different characters with sort of equal passion and understanding. So I think it's kind of a way of looking at the world. What you're interested in, or what I'm interested in, is why people do what they do, why they behave in ways that they behave, which actually I think in real life means that sort of phenomenologically being interested in why people behave that way means that we sometimes tend to excuse bad behavior because it's so interesting for us professionally. I think that's very specific to playwriting, even more maybe than screenwriting, because even writing a screenplay is usually you have a point of view with one character. And then, but writing for a live performance, I think, is also key in that. For me, I'm not religious, so going to the theatre is the closest thing that I have to a sort of ritualized collective experience that I share with other people, and there are times when you're in the theatre as a member of the audience and as a theatre maker when what happens is that something happens and there's something transcendent about the experience. And I mean, I'm not usually one to mystify the process, but there is, that happens. It doesn't happen very often. You have to go see a lot of bad theatre to actually experience it, rarely. But if you've experienced it as an audience member and particularly as a theatre maker, I think that you spend then the rest of your life chasing that high, I think.
George Devine, who was the first artistic director of the Royal Court, famously said you should choose your theatre as you choose your religion. And I think there is something in that sort of sense, that it is a sort of secular communion of various kinds. You picked up the thing about the relationship between screen and stage, and Charlene, you said you've started working